We're back with our second part of the talk, and we're going to shift from the very pleasant side of science to the dark side of science and the challenges in academia. In this short part of our podcast, I'd like to hear your opinion on several maybe of the most pressing problems. We are now living in a very, very dynamic and changing environment, especially in the US with the current presidential elections and the things that are going on with NIH there, the National Institute of Health. Also in Europe, we have very, very dynamic changes in terms of funding of science and etc. I start usually by summarizing some of the biggest, to me personally, problems and then challenges. Of course, feel free to pick up something else. I will just briefly mention them because I've already done this several times and maybe the listeners already know about my opinion. But one of the striking and most obvious to me personally is the publishing, how publishing works. Also, we talk about this postdoc crisis, meaning that highly trained PhD students, they leave academia, which can be good, of course, for their personal development, but academia suffers. And probably one of the most obvious reasons for that is the lack of stability and the tenure track positions. We just talked in the time between the first part and the second part about reproducibility and replicability of experiments. Maybe we can talk about it. And of course, there are many others with power abuse or like gender inequalities, many other topics. I'd like to hear your opinion. Pick something, whatever you want, and then let's see what is your opinion on that problem. And then maybe, do you have any like kind of solution? What can we do to address it and maybe solve it,
I'm going to start on the positive side because I agree. There are lots of issues with the system, but I personally feel very, very privileged to be doing what I'm doing. I mean, when you think about the fact that I can have a question in my head and that I'm able to go and answer that question. I think that's such a privileged position to be. So I think as scientists, we also have to acknowledge that aspect of it, that it's crazy what we are doing and the kind of flexibility that we have to do that. That changes obviously across different levels of the scientific system, but I think even at a bachelor's or a master's level, being able to acquire the kind of knowledge that we do, I think, is such a privilege. And to be able to talk about these things with people we're working with is such a privilege. So let's start off with that. I want to put that out there. That's important to me to put it out there. The system is broken in some regards. Publishing is a catastrophe right now. Trying to find reviewers for papers is almost impossible. So I'm editor of some journals, and you have to constantly have about 5 alternates because you know that the first 4 people you ask are going to turn you down, if they even turn you down. So if they even actually respond to the review request, I think that's something we have to pay attention to very quickly. There are some ways around this. So there's initiatives where you don't necessarily have to have your paper peer reviewed by a couple of reviewers, but you put up your paper for public review and people can come in and comment on your paper and what needs to be changed, and you can make an initiative to engage in that discussion, which is one approach. The preprint servers are a great way of making sure that research is getting out there outside of the publication system. Of course, it doesn't have that quality assurance that we and our funders like to have, but I think it's a great way of getting our work out there. And we need to start making the review system more efficient.
What do you think of like journals paying reviewers, for example? Like certain, I don't know, 200 euros per paper.
It causes a problem because they are not going to bear those costs themselves, which means those costs are going to be pushed back onto the publishing process, and then we start to bias who's publishing in which journals. We're seeing this with the gold access publication system, right? In terms of who has the money to publish open access in certain journals, which is making the science that's more easily accessible start to be biased towards institutions that have the money to pay those kinds of fees.
But isn't it already biased?
It is biased,
Yeah,
absolutely.
yeah,
But we're giving it a further
Yeah,
initiative
yeah.
now if you're going to start putting up those costs. So I think before we start paying reviewers, we need to have the discussion about how we're going to pay the reviewers. Where are those costs going to come from? And where are they going to be reclaimed from?
Honestly, I'm very curious, like to publish an open source publication in Nature, let's say. The cost is
Exactly.
like $12,000-$13,000.
Exactly.
Where is this money going?
Exactly.
No, that is. I don't understand how can it cost $13,000 to put a PDF file that is mostly formatted
Exactly.
in a perfect way online and like printed in some journal. Like, I mean, you have in a journal like one issue of Nature's magazine, you have about 50, 60, 100 pages. I know you have, let's say, 30 papers times 12,000. And this is not even the open access. This is the paid version.
Yeah.
So something is wrong there.
Something is definitely wrong
Yeah,
with the system. Yes, and this is we're talking about it, which I think is good.
Yeah.
So we're talking about ways around it as well. And I think one of the greatest things that has happened recently are the preprint servers. And everything in my lab is on these preprint servers. So you do not have to go through a journal in order to get access to my papers. We try and pay for open access fees for papers that are grant funded, where we have the kind of funds to do that. But at the same time, like I said, that's, I'm contributing to the system then in terms of biasing whose work is more easily accessible as opposed to the others. So that's one thing that the preprint servers really help us to work against.
There was a very interesting idea of like in the future, maybe you have preprints and then the journals will fight for the best paper to get published there, which would be cool, but maybe it will take some time. But I think that we have to work as a community, to drive this change. And I don't see this happening, I mean, I've talked to some amount of people with different backgrounds, and they acknowledge the problem, but they are like, okay, it's kind of my feeling is I don't have time to deal with that. I don't have the energy. Maybe somebody else. I don't understand. I just don't get it.
I think there are a lot of people out there who are investing the energy into changing the system and thinking about how we can change the system. This is what we're seeing now, right? That there's a lot more discussion about things that there wouldn't have been a discussion about before in psychology before 2010. So we weren't talking about these things. Everybody was sort of murmuring about it in the back rooms, but nobody was talking about it openly. We're talking about it openly. So I think it's important to acknowledge that effort. Obviously, people don't have the time. That's also part of the failing of the system, that we're constantly looking for the next. If you're a PhD student who needs X papers before they're done with the PhD, you don't have the time to go and challenge the system. You really don't. And the professors at the same time have different pressures that prevent you from challenging the system. So there's definitely more work that needs to be done there. But there are people who are doing. Yeah,
indeed, there are also. I've seen also in social media, some interesting cases. But then you have like the publishing that is connected to the funding agency, right? They see, you have like 3 Nature papers or whatever, so you're a good scientist, What is this type of measure,
Yes.
How do you think about that?
We're trying to change that as well, right? So one of the things that a lot of so our institute, for instance, has started putting into place that we will not just go by these metrics alone. A lot of universities are also putting into place systems where you look at the quality of the papers that somebody is submitting to when they apply for a position, so that we're trying to distance ourselves from these metrics as much as possible. I do think that's happening. I also think that social media plays a role here to a great extent, because the papers and the people you find out about through social media are, it's sort of flattening the field a little bit, because it makes it so much easier for you to get your research out there, to get your name out there, even without that Nature publication. So I think there's definitely change that's happening. And there's definitely an awareness about the issues of using these metrics. Yes, they still hold reign quite a bit, but there is definitely more awareness about it.
How long does it usually take to put a paper out? Like from submitting to in your field?
Okay. You want to look before that as well, because when you work with babies, how long does it take to actually complete a study?
This is a whole different field.
And that's something that needs to be put in mind. It varies dramatically, but I would say we've never had something go through in less than 6 months. And we've had things that have taken 2 years as well.
This is just not correct. This is insanely wrong. First of all, it slows down science, it slows down you, it slows down everything. I don't understand that.
But like I said, the preprint servers are helping you combat that quite a bit, right? And again, that in combination with our social networks helps combat that as well. So it's very common now for me to open up Blue Sky now and figure out, okay, who's just published a preprint that would be of interest to me, and I'm able to get to it so much easier. And I'm getting to these things more often than not. I've seen something as a preprint way before I've seen it as a journal publication, and that's the version that I'm going with. So I do think there's change there as well.
Well, is there anything else that is bothering you, for example, a lot?
Bothering me a lot. What else was on your list there?
Reproducibility, tenured positions.
Related. Tenured positions. So let's go to the reproducibility, and then we'll get to the tenured position. The reproducibility is something that there's been a lot of focus on. It harks back to the publication system, obviously, because of I think there's, again, much greater awareness about this, especially in psychology. There's a lot of talk about this. It's not all healed yet, but it has been the case that you can push back against the system. And I tend to quite frequently. So we have had papers where the editor and the reviewer say that's a null result, so therefore we're not going to go about it. But we can push back and say, well, it's a well-powered null result that we're talking about here. And this is really not in keeping with the times that we're living in. So maybe you want to rethink that decision a little bit. And I have found that kind of pushback does get somebody to sort of take a minute. It doesn't mean the paper's getting accepted, but it has stopped somebody in their tracks for a minute and to think about what's going on.
Very interesting. What is it's harder it's crazy. I don't know, especially probably you had reviewer 2 who is always saying I don't like it, and like, what? Who are you to decide? It's, I don't know.
I think with age you get to accept that a little bit more. With age and maybe a bit of stability as well, you get to accept that a bit more. I think reviewer 2 shattered me when I was a PhD student and a postdoc, and now you're just able to put it away, leave it to the side, and get back to it.
I personally understand it, and honestly, I don't care if somebody says, I don't like this. Fine, it's your personal preference of choice or whatever, but say something critical, arguments, and then let's make it better. This is the point of review, to make a paper better, or say, hey, this is too bad, we cannot publish it here. But personal beliefs and likings is like, come on, man, we have to grow up.
That's not just a reviewer problem. That's also an editor problem. So those kind of comments also need to be stopped at the editorial desk before it reaches the author. So it's not all on reviewer too. Yes, that was the person who put out something like that, but it's also a bad editor who's not stopping certain comments coming through.
Very interesting. Very interesting. And what about the tenured positions?
Again, I don't think there's a magical solution to this. I personally see a bit more flexibility regarding this in certain systems. I'm a big fan of the British system, where you've got way more lecturer positions and you don't have these little kingdoms as the German system tends to accumulate. Obviously, you have the other end of the other extreme there, where you've got a lot of people with absolutely no funding to do the research that they can be doing. And these are brilliant people who are not getting research funding. The research system is very competitive. So it's about reaching some sort of balance between the kingdoms in Germany and the lone wolves, shall we call them, in the UK. But I think that is something that we are starting in Germany to think towards, going towards as an alternative. So we are thinking about creating more of these tenure track positions or lecturer positions. You've got to bear in mind that's going to solve the problem for one generation. Yeah. It's going to help one generation, then it's going to be like that for another 30 years before the next generation gets to benefit from this. So we're not going to heal it through this. I also think it's important, and again, I know very well that I speak from the privileged position of somebody having a tenured position when I say this, but I think it's important to emphasize the kind of skills that we gain in academia that do make us qualified for other positions. So I think it's important to emphasize that when you're talking to people, that you're learning so much stuff. The things that the people in my group have gone on to do are very varied and not restricted just to an academic career. So there are benefits to staying in academia for a while and then leaving with that as well.
Of course, it's your personal choice.
Absolutely.
And maybe some environmental factor play a role, right? If you have a family or you want to take care, or parents, or some other issues, and where are you at, and of course, what is your goal, etc. So yeah, science is very nice, I love it, but academia still needs to be improved, in my humble opinion. Nivi, thank you very much also for this part of the discussion and for the positive notion. And with this, I'd like to conclude our episode. And once again, thank you for being here.
Thank you. Thank you so much, especially for the second part as well. It's nice to talk about other aspects of academia. Yeah.
Thanks.